Thanks so much, Ashley. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to the Carolyn for Joyce community again. We're on with you all last month. Happy to see that hopefully we didn't offend anybody. You came back to get more information. Our mission today is hopefully aligned with yours, which is to educate and share information that we've gleaned over multiple decades of living in the special needs community, of consulting with families around the country on different planning challenges that they've had. And hopefully we can make this one a little more interactive than our last session was. My colleague Randi Gillespie will be manning the chat for us today. And so if you have a question, if Randi can quickly answer it, she'll do that and share that response back with the entire community of people on today's webinar. At certain times, we'll take pauses and hopefully have some discussion back and forth. So we need to have you unmute yourself then, but until then, if you would stay muted, that'll probably help everybody be able to pay attention. So with that, we'll move forward. As Ashley said, I've lived 50 plus years with a sibling with autism. And in fact, let me share my screen here so you can see him. Here we go. All right, so this is my brother Sean in the foreground of the slides, and he is the inspiration for Oak Wealth Advisors. As you can tell in this photo, and I think we talked about this in the last presentation, in a family with special needs, oftentimes the loved one with a disability is front and center for everything. So this is my 6th birthday. I got a Snoopy doll. Guess who else got one? Look who's featured in the photo. He's the one who's in focus. He's closest to the camera. I know what that's like. I know the challenges of having a sibling. I also know what the challenges are as a parent. I don't have a loved one with a disability, but Randi does, our other firm members do. Most of our clients are the parents of a child with a disability. So we're living it, we get it, but hopefully you can see in this photo that my brother is in the box. I'm going to help all of you today think like I was back when I was 6 years old, outside the box. We're going to be thinking outside the box, thinking about what else can we do? What are the other alternatives? And trying to understand that there is no one path that everyone should follow for success. And I think by sharing your guys' successes, failures, and challenges with each other through the community of Together for Choice and on today's webinar, you'll have the greatest possible success. So as Ashley mentioned, I've been in this since 2008, focusing our whole practice on families like yours with loved ones with special needs. As you can tell, I've got a limited set of business apparel, so I'm wearing the exact same shirt and sport coat that are in the photo here. So for those of you who are keeping track, that's one of 2. So the other thing that's important to know is that our firm is so dedicated to special needs that the NAPFA organization, which is for all fiduciary financial advisors, gave us their 2023 Excellence in DEI Award. I felt like we were undeserving. So I really asked the organization, why us? And the answer was that we're so deep and ingrained in the families we serve. Like we're mission focused around helping people with special needs. We do it through the artwork behind Randi. That's actually a mural that was painted by 3 different artists with a group here in Chicago. It's actually what was a banner hanging on a lamppost in a western suburb of Chicago. They painted it black, gave a blank canvas to 3 individuals, and they painted what ends up being a piece of art that everybody who sees it smiles. And so that's what we try to do. We try to find ways to integrate the community around us into our practice. And hopefully we'll be integrating as many of you as possible in today's presentation to share your ideas and stories. So I want to start by saying that language can be challenging, especially in the special needs community. We will try not to offend anybody. My guess is that by using words like disability and special needs interchangeably, I'm going to offend all of you at some point. I'm also going to try to use person-first language, where we talk about the individual before the diagnosis. And I'm also going to probably use other words in describing things that might set someone off. And I apologize for that. It's certainly not my intention. I just want everybody to understand that the language is difficult. In some cases, there might be 2 terms for the same thing. We get into talking about decision-making, which is really our first topic today. You'll see that depending on where you live in the country, the words you use for someone who gets to take over the rights for someone else is different. So bear with me, ask questions as you need to, and hopefully we can get all of your questions and concerns addressed today. So to start, these are what we consider to be the 8 essential elements of a special needs plan. Public benefits being the base of everything you're trying to achieve and support your loved one with, beyond what your own family resources are. On our last session, we talked about ABLE accounts, special needs trusts, and the importance of beneficiary designations so that when parents and other loved ones pass on, those assets move swiftly and easily the people we want to have receive them without having them lose or jeopardize their benefits.
Excuse me, Mike.
Yes, Randy.
I apologize. There is one quick question about ABLE accounts from the prior presentation.
Okay.
Is there a way to deposit cash to either the debit card or to the investments?
So depending on the state you're in and the state plan you're utilizing for an ABLE account, the deposit process is based on their rules and regulations. Typically, cash is not going to be something you can deposit. You'll need to convert that to a check and send a check in to be deposited, or do an online transfer from an account that's linked to the ABLE account. But I don't know of any way to use cash at a bank ATM to deposit it, because as we know with an ABLE account, it's run through a state organization and a third-party administrator. You can't get an ABLE account through a bank or other financial institution where you might have other accounts. So cash is a difficult thing to deposit. It's best if the person who gets the cash gives it to someone else. They write a check on behalf of the person who gave them the cash and make that deposit into the ABLE account. Any other questions on ABLE accounts or special needs trust real quickly from our last session before we move on to today's topics? All right, we will have some time at the end. So if those topics come up and you want to revisit those, I'm happy to do that at the end of today's presentation. But today we're going to be focused on decision makers, which is the bottom of that little picture, vocational planning, housing planning, which obviously Together for Choice is a major asset in your life for doing that, and care guides, or what we call letters of intent. And so those will be the focus of today's presentation. We'll start with decision makers. The different people we're going to talk about, the different roles, are as follows: the individual, him or herself, the guardian or conservator, an agent under a power of attorney, a supporter of someone through a supported decision-making process, a trustee, and a caregiver. And oftentimes we'll have families come in and talk with us, and they have one sibling in mind to play all these roles, or some relative. And in our opinion, that's really poor planning. That's putting a lot on someone's shoulders. And in some cases, you'll have multiple decision makers involved in your loved one's future. And the reason why this topic is so difficult for so many is that what you're really thinking about is when mom and dad are gone, who's going to take over? Nobody's going to provide better care, better oversight, or have a better set of knowledge to assist their loved one than a parent. But when that parent's no longer able to do that, whether they're still alive and just not able, or whether they've passed on, understanding the roles of the different people and knowing which ones are most appropriate will help your loved one have the best sustained future. Let's take them one at a time. The individual themselves. For those of you who've got loved ones who are higher functioning, who might just need some occasional assistance, they can probably be their own decision maker with some guidance and oversight. And so that's the most independent of all these choices, but also the most risky. Right? If our loved one doesn't have any formal arrangement to assist them with decision making, any decision they make, they have to be bound by. There's no do-overs like in kickball on a grade school playground. There's no ability to reverse a contract if they signed for it legally as an adult over age 18. There's the risk of exploitation, which I think all of us, regardless of our loved ones' fears or abilities, skills or abilities, we worry about. I have 2 children. Neither of them happen to have a diagnosis of any type of special need, but I still worry about them, right? They can make mistakes, be taken advantage of. They're relatively naive, despite the fact they're older teenagers. And so that's a worry all parents have, and it's exacerbated if there's a diagnosis on top of it. And so that's important to understand. Ideally, everybody would love to have their child live as independently as possible. But for many of us, that's probably not a realistic opportunity. So let's look at the other choices that are out there. The opposite side of full independence and the person making all their own decisions is what's called a guardianship or conservatorship. I mentioned the language thing at the beginning of the presentation. In California and a few other states, it's called the conservatorship, and the person who's in charge and gets the rights is the conservator. In Illinois and other states we work with, it's a guardianship, and the person's title who's in charge is the guardian. This is the most formal and thorough form of protection. Technically, it's a transfer of rights from the individual with a disability to someone else who will be the decision maker for that person. In a plenary guardianship or a full conservatorship, it's literally a transfer of all rights from the individual to the other named person. that basically eliminates the risk of exploitation. There's no chance someone can financially take advantage of someone who can't open an account, can't transact in the account, might be given limited spending by their guardian or conservator, but that's only for facilitation purposes. There's really no rights attached to that. It also eliminates, in some states, the ability to marry, get a driver's license, and have other types of rights like that, voting, for example. In some states, you can parse those out. You can have a more specific guardianship or conservatorship, which indicates that we're going to maintain these rights for the individual, but transfer these other rights. And typically, the two areas people are most concerned about are going to be healthcare and finances. Right? We don't want to set aside money in an ABLE account, special needs trust, or other accounts for our loved one, only to have someone else with, bad intentions drain those accounts. We also don't want to have the person going out without proper health care, proper decision making around their health. So by doing a guardianship or conservatorship, someone else who has better knowledge about those things can be in charge and make those decisions on behalf of the individual. It's important to understand, though, that a guardianship, being the biggest transfer of rights and decision making, also has the greatest expense, and I would argue sometimes the hardest emotional impact on the family. Now, every state's process is a little bit different, but in order to go through a guardianship or conservatorship, it goes through the court system. So you have to involve a judge. The judge has to make a determination. Now, many people try to do the guardianship process themselves, not involve an attorney. Our recommendation is you talk to someone who works in the probate area of law, who can help educate you on the process so that you're not going to have any surprises. Because sometimes the judge has to ask difficult questions with your loved one, either on a Zoom with you or in person in a courtroom. And a courtroom can be an intimidating place for anybody. And you think about someone who's got some anxiety issues as part of their diagnosis, that can be incredibly intimidating. And if the judge asks questions about that person's abilities, and you've spent their entire lifetime building them up, talking about expectations and future hopes, and never sharing anything negative about their challenges, what can be difficult for that person to then tell the judge, oh no, I can't do those things. When in fact, maybe they can't, and you're hoping they will at some point. But the judge needs to really understand what is the person's abilities and what is the level of dedication and skill of the person who's asking to be appointed as the conservator or the guardian. So understand that process can be emotionally challenging with the judge. And if at some point your child's development continues, such that while the guardianship or conservatorship was appropriate when they were 18 or 20 years old, when you first put it in place, maybe at 25 or 30, they've increased their skills. Maybe you don't want to have that much of a restriction on their rights, and you want to have the guardianship or conservatorship removed and give the person back some or more or all of their rights. Well, in order for that to happen, you're back in the courtroom. And if you get the same judge, you're basically asking that person to reverse him or herself from what they decided before. So if you're going to go through that process, you want to make sure you have good documentation about what has changed. Because like any of us, it's tough to say, oh, you know what, I was wrong. Well, for people in black robes, it's even harder unless they're given the proper evidence to reverse their own decision. So just keep that in mind, that it's a process. It can be incredibly valuable. If your loved one has limited capacity for decision-making, maybe doesn't have communication skills and can't let others know what they want or need, a guardianship is a fantastic way to protect them and make sure they get everything they need throughout the rest of their life. In fact, in many cases, you can request that certain people be considered as a successor, conservator, or guardian. Because if you are named as the one currently and you die, well, then whom? Well, if a person needs that type of service and there's no one in the family stepping up and there's no one that's been recommended to the court will provide something called a guardian ad litem. I'm not sure what the exact term of art is in California, other states that have conservatorship, but basically it's a court-appointed person or agency that'll step in and do that and report back to the court, much like the reporting is required of a parent who is the guardian, as far as like what's going on, are the needs being met, are the finances being maintained, those kinds of reporting things. So that's how guardianship or conservatorship works. Go ahead. Question.
With the expense of guardianship, is it a filing fee? Is it a court-related cost, or are there ongoing fees throughout the year that parents and families have to kind of contend with?
right? So the costs for guardianship are going to vary significantly depending on the state and the approach you want to take. If you hire a high-end attorney who does probate law, we'll walk you through that process. You'll be paying their hours, their fee for attending the court session with you. You can run up several $1,000s in fees. Court costs for the appearance, that's going to be standard across whether you do it yourself or do it with an attorney. And so those are the kinds of costs you're looking at. It's really the legal fees involved with the support of getting it in place. On an ongoing basis, if you want to do the reporting yourself, there's very little ongoing cost after that point. I don't know that cost would be a reason to not do it. I think it's really looking at that continuum, right? You think about someone on an autism spectrum. There's those who are incredibly high functioning who, run major companies. And you have those who have profound challenges, maybe multiple diagnoses, but they're still on the autism spectrum, who don't have the ability to take care of themselves, make good decisions, and communicate. Well, for those people that are on the lower end of that spectrum in terms of decision making, a guardianship or conservatorship is by far the best choice. It's going to protect them the most. And so I really think about it that way, is that as we're looking at these options, the completely independent individual and the guardianship conservatorship are on the opposite ends of the spectrum. And there's no right or wrong answer. You might choose this and decide later, I don't like it. It's not the best answer for our child. You can ask the judge to reverse him or herself, change that, remove the guardianship, or remove part of it. Maybe you go for a full guardianship and you decide, you know what? We'd like to have these sets of rights given back to the person. Fine, go do that. So with all of these things we're going to talk about, it's not like anything is set in stone. You go forth with the process you think is most appropriate, knowing you can always change and amend and add or subtract as you go forward. But a guardianship is the most significant of those choices.
So I just want to add that in California, guardianship or conservatorship, we call it in California, for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are called limited partnership. So that's set aside for people with IDD. And so in terms of the rights, I think there are like 12 or 10 or 12 rights or something in California. And basically, depending on the person's capacity, they assign those rights to the conservator. So just wanted to, it's only for people with IDD in the state of California. So just wanted to add that. And also for the expense part, if the family, for the most part, most families go with another family member in assigning that, designating the guardian. But if you decide to go with a professional fiduciary who can take on the role as a guardian, then that would actually, that would be something that would have to be set up through the special needs trust that would pay for that expense. So Mike, would you like to talk more about that? I think when somebody's asking about the expense only in setting up the guardianship, it all depends whether you assign and designate a professional guardian versus a family member.
Right, thanks, Ashley. So again, depending on what state you're in, your options within a guardianship or conservatorship will vary. And I think the path you go down, it can be wildly different. Again, I would say that among the decision-making choices, this could be the most expensive. Others have no expense associated with them at all. But I think it really depends on your state. So I wouldn't want to give advice to anybody on any of this stuff. And I would tell you as a caveat to all the discussion today, we're not trying to tell anybody on this call what's best for them and their family. You have to think about what the options are and hopefully understand your choices and make the most appropriate one for you. I don't know that you can pin down a price, even in a single state, as far as what it's going to cost long-term, based on whether you use professional fiduciaries as part of your planning, whether you try to keep it all within the family, whether you go through the court hearing process by yourself or with an attorney. There'll be a lot of variables. But I think it's important to ask those questions if you choose to move forward with an attorney or hire a professional to play a role. What are those costs up front and what are those ongoing costs? So at least I need a budget for this, where those resources are going to come from, and you can make the best possible decision. So the next one to consider, which we would say is the closest in terms of getting help for the individual, would be a power of attorney. And the person who's given the power through this document is called the agent. So the agent under a power of attorney is given a specific set of rights and abilities. Typically, it falls into one of two categories, which we just mentioned under the guardianship conservatorship discussion. Those are a power of attorney for healthcare and a power of attorney for property or for the estate. Again, each state uses slightly different language, makes it more complicated on a national presentation to really narrow that for you. But one's going to deal with healthcare decisions, one's going to deal with financial decisions and be narrow there. So with an agent under a power of attorney, a lot of times people with no disability will do these documents. It's often kind of a standard estate planning document you might get when you create your will or your revocable trust for your family. In doing so, you're basically saying that if I'm not able to make a decision because I'm not available, or for whatever reason, I just can't sign a document or acknowledge to a medical professional what I want done, the person I've named on my document, my agent, can make that decision for me and it's binding. Okay. So it's only to be in the case when the person can't make their own decision or they wish to defer it to the person they've named as the agent. So what's different between this and a guardianship or conservatorship is that in that case, the rights are transferred, the decision-making is transferred to someone else. With a power of attorney, the person retains all the rights, but they basically say, if I can't do it, or if I'm not available to do it, someone else can do that action for me. And an example we give to help people understand how that's different is if you go with your child to a medical appointment and the doctor indicates that the best course of action they believe for the person's long-term health is to go through this battery of shots over the next 6 months. Each shot will be painful, but if you do the 6 months of shots, you're going to have a much better lifespan. You'll have a much healthier life, and everything in your life will be better from a health standpoint. Well, if the individual hears, I have to get shots once a month for 6 months, and they're thinking short term, like that's going to hurt and not be fun, versus who knows what a long life actually is. It's hard to imagine that with or without a disability. What does that really mean? But the parent thinks, oh my gosh, this is going to be fantastic. If you just do these shots, you'll have a longer, healthier life. That's a no-brainer. You should do that. In that circumstance, the individual's choice of not getting the shots will trump the parent's desire to have the shots given. Because the person can make the decision and has the ability and capacity to sign a power of attorney document naming typically a parent to be their agent. They also have the ability to make their own decision. So that's an important differentiating factor. If you're worried that your loved one would not make good healthcare decisions when confronted with a situation like that, maybe a limited guardianship or limited conservatorship would make sense, because you want to make sure they get the best possible healthcare. And you'll know better than they will in most cases what's best for them health-wise. And so in that case, the power of attorney can be rather limited. It has the ability to really assist with information gathering. For example, if your loved one has an account that's been opened for them, the agent can get the information. So remember, with an ABLE account, it has to be open in their name. With a power of attorney, that agent can make investment decisions, can contact the plan administrator and make changes to the underlying structure of the plan. They can work directly with a trustee if they have a power of attorney with respect to property. There's all kinds of things that can be done with a power of attorney, but it does not, get the last line, does not remove the consequences of a bad decision from the individual. So that would be another thing to consider. Relatively inexpensive. In many states, you can actually download a form that'll be completely legally binding and do that. So that's a relatively low cost. You're working with a law firm. It's a very inexpensive document for them to create. It's mostly boilerplate based on state rules. You sign it as the agent, the individual signs it, giving you that agency right, and you're done. You keep a copy, typically they keep a copy, and you just have to present that if someone should ever challenge your ability to help make the decisions. Any questions under powers of attorney? Okay, move on to supported decision-making. This is one of the newest techniques, and it's even more limited than a power of attorney. In some cases, people would like to have someone help them for a specific decision or a specific task, and actually give them the legal rights to do that. But with supported decision-making, the idea is the person retains their decision-making authority, but someone else they name specifically can assist with information gathering, education, and support in making that decision. So whether it's a significant healthcare decision, whether it's a major purchase, things like that, we want to bring someone in to help make the best possible decision. Supported decision-making in the states that allow it allows the individual to pick a person for that specific task. So maybe they pick, one of their siblings who is close in age to them, who's better with technology, when they're trying to decide which cell phone to get and which plan to choose. Other than that, they can make their other decisions, but that can be complicated and expensive if you make the wrong decision. So maybe they take that sibling with them, and under supported decision-making, that sibling can ask all kinds of questions, share details, and get the information that they need to make the best decision. A little bit less strong than a power of attorney, which would actually allow that person to sign the contract at the phone company in that situation. So support decision-making does not give a legal right for someone to make a decision. It allows them to gather information, get documents, and provide the information that the individual needs to make their own decision. And there's no cost to establish that. You have to go to your home state, then search for supported decision-making documents. In some cases, you need to have someone notarize that. Other cases, it's a matter of the two parties signing it, then making that available to whoever it is you're working with. It needs to see that someone else can help with that decision-making process. But as I mentioned, it's relatively new. And if you look at this map, not meant to be an eye chart, but as during our last session, we love these little state maps. As you can see here, it's by no means a national opportunity yet. The green states all have legislation in place that allows individuals to have supporters for their decision-making. The yellow is in process. It's mostly the Southeast. And then there's red states kind of pocketing all across the country, which currently have nothing in process. My guess is if we have this session together in 10 years, everything will be green. I don't see a reason why a state wouldn't allow this. All it is creating a little more opportunity for independence and a little more freedom for assistance for our loved ones with disabilities. Okay, a trustee. Sometimes we have clients come in and they think, all right, well, we've got a trust document, hopefully a special needs trust for our loved one, and we've got the trustee name. So we're set. All the decision making is going to run through the trustee. That's not how it works. So for any decision that involves anything outside the assets in the trustee has no direct impact on that. The trustee's sole focus in terms of decision making has to do with the trust assets. So making sure tax returns get filed, determining how they're going to be invested, making sure the individual has distributions that are done appropriately, they don't jeopardize benefits. It's all focused on the trust assets, communication with the beneficiary, and making sure that the trust supports the individual as intended by the trust document, how it's written. That's it. So you might have the greatest trustee in the world. Family loves that person or agency. They're not going to assist with healthcare decisions. They've got no rights. They're not going to assist with other financial decisions related to assets or accounts outside the trust. A trustee cannot impact an able account in any way, shape, or form, just the assets in the trust. But to remind our families we work with that it's important to have a trustee who really understands all the things that a trustee has to do in managing typically what ends up being all the assets for the individual when mom and dad and grandparents pass away. Because we want the assets to flow into the special needs trust. So the trustee is going to have a lot of responsibility, but it's not an all-encompassing responsibility as a guardian would have or a conservator. So understanding that the trustee's really responsibility is limited to trust assets, that's it. And so the idea that any of us have Superman living in their family, and that one person's going to be able to jump up and be the trustee, maybe also be the guardian, that's a huge ask, right? And oftentimes, I'd say more often than not, our families have a sibling named, or maybe even one of their own siblings at the parent level, so an aunt or uncle named to play that role. Well, we'll push back pretty hard in those discussions that if you name, talking to the parents now, if you name a peer, whether it's a friend or a relative who's the aunt or uncle of the individual we're trying to care for, aren't they going to die about the same time you do? That's not a very good long-term solution. Maybe you pick a sibling of the individual. Okay, that can work, but is that sibling going to stay in touch? In our experience, probably 2/3 of all families have siblings who absolutely adore their loved one with a disability and they want to be involved in some capacity. Maybe this is a good role. Maybe, as we talked about in our last session, having them be the trust protector to hire and fire trustees and investment managers is a more appropriate choice, a little bit less cumbersome. No legal liability for that. That would be a better choice than use professionals to play those roles. Again, if you have a professional trustee or a professional investment manager handling the asset side of it on the investments, consider that as part of your budget, right? You got to account for that in terms of what the trust assets have to pay for. If you name a relative, maybe they'll do it for free. Probably not the best solution. You probably should pay them for their role and services. But some of these families are trying to do this on the cheap, and they'll say, I'll just name a sibling to do it, no cost. They're going to do it for free. They'll be happy to do it. I'll move on to the next discussion. Probably not the best choice. Caregiver. This is one that blows my mind. I don't know how often we assume in our planning that a sibling or a friend or a relative is going to be the caregiver. I'll give you my own personal experience. My parents had in their documents that when they pass on, my brother would be taken care of by a family friend who we've always called aunt and uncle. They would just do it. Well, at best, we would see that family once every 2 years. So the idea that if my parents both died in a tragic accident, or my brother was still young enough to need that kind of care, these people who are, not even related to us, who are good family friends, are going to step in and provide 24/7 oversight is ridiculous. Yet that's what their plan was. And I don't know that it's that uncommon that people expect a relative to step up and be the caregiver. And depending on the level of need, it could be 24/7. Maybe it's going to be just a weekly check-in. That's obviously on the other end of the spectrum. But think about what that level of care is going to be. And later on in today's session, we'll talk about how to document that for future caregivers. But a caregiver is going to have a lot of time spent with your loved one. They have no legal standing. They can't make any of those decisions. So we need to know that the caregiver is going to be super important. We want a loving, supportive person. If there's medical issues involved with that, we want a licensed nurse to be playing that role in most cases. And that's obviously a cost. But they're not going to have any legal rights. The individual can't name typically an agency that's providing care to be a guardian or to be the agent because there's a conflict of interest there. So we want to make sure that we think about these different roles and which ones are appropriate for our loved one. But if the loved one's going to need ongoing care and oversight, understand that those other roles we talked about, it's not going to be the same person. Okay. So with that, I think that covers our decision-making group. Any questions related to decision-making before we move on to the other topics?
Michael, can you tell us the difference between trustee and trust protector? Sorry, Randy, I'm sorry.
No, I was just starting to write.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
So the trustee is the person who is legally responsible for all the trust operations. So that would include the investment management, the communication with the individual about their needs, the distributions to the individual or the care providers or services or goods they want to buy. So from a trust that has special needs involved, so special needs trust, we want the trustee paying those people directly, not giving the money to the individual to then forward on. That creates problems. The trustee also has to file the tax returns. And in many states, depending on what's going on, they have to file annual reports with the state Social Security office showing what the money was spent for. Okay, so those are the responsibilities of the trustee. It's a fiduciary responsibility, meaning that by law, they have to do what's in the best interest of the beneficiary. A trust protector is a relatively new concept, and it allows an individual or an agency or can be a board of people, so a community of people that come together to choose to replace the trustee with another professional trustee, or if it's split where there's a trustee and an investment manager, you can also fire and hire a new investment firm to manage the assets. In some cases, the trustee plays all those roles. In other cases, the trustee may delegate the investment responsibility to an investment firm to manage the assets in the trust. The trust protector has no legal liability to the trust itself or the beneficiary, but they're given the right to hire and fire the professionals that are involved. What that does is it allows the beneficiary to always have people who are doing the best possible work for them, because those people are going to be held accountable to the trust protector. And they can be fired like that if they don't do a good job. And the reason for having the trust protector role is that if you name a corporate trustee and you love the people that are there and you're very comfortable that group's going to be wonderful for your loved one, and that company gets bought by a bigger company or some other group that's outside the state, and they change the structure and they limit the resources, and all of a sudden there's an 800 number that you call for help. There's no person. And you lose that contact, you lose that level of support you expected when you created the trust. Well, unless there's something written into the trust document that allows you to replace that trustee, it's very difficult and expensive. We've gone through this with 2 different clients where it costs thousands of dollars of legal fees to force the trustee to resign because there's nothing in the document that requires it. So the trust protector allows that accountability to be held in perpetuity, that no matter how long the individual lives, no matter how many changes are needed, there's people who can hire and fire the trustee. Okay. Any other questions related to decision making? Again, if you walk away with nothing else, there is no one right answer for everyone. And there's no one single answer that may be appropriate for your loved one's entire lifespan. It may change, but understanding those different choices will help you figure out how to navigate that in your journey. Okay. Move on to vocation. This is where the audience participation needs to be picked up a little bit. So with respect to careers, I will start and finish with this one comment. Often the most valuable thing for your loved one related to their work has nothing to do with what they get paid. The community they have with their coworkers, their sense of pride for having a place to go that wants them there working, the fact they have an activity to look forward to every day, a place to go, community to be involved with. Those can be invaluable. They're not going to show up on the W-2. They're not going to be part of the things you negotiate for when you're trying to get a raise. But those can be incredibly valuable things. With that being said, it's important to understand that vocational choices can impact benefits. We talked earlier, and you've learned about benefits in other sessions, about how valuable SSI and SSDI eventually can be. Well, if you're looking at SSI, if your loved one has turned 18, you qualified for SSI and Medicaid services, if you're getting some vocational supports through the Medicaid services and waiver programs in your home state, great, that's all awesome. If the person starts making too much money because they're successful with their career, you're going to start losing the SSI. Without going through all the calculations, just understand that roughly you'll lose $1 of your SSI for every $2 you earn. The math is much more complicated than that, but that's a basic understanding of how it's going to work. And so if you think about it, if you're making more than $2,000 a month, it's actually less than that. If you make more than $2,000 a month, you're not going to get SSI anymore. In some states, you must have $1 of SSI income to qualify for Medicaid. Keep that in mind when you're thinking about what the right job is for your loved one. Also, keep in mind that with respect to the earnings, in my example, if the individual's making $2,000 a month, but they can't get themselves to work and they can't work independently, they have to have someone assisting them, sitting with them, as an aid. Well, the cost of those things, the fair market value of those costs, even if the aid's provided for free from an agency, the value of that service can be used to reduce the person's earnings for reporting purposes. So in that example, they earned $2,000, but because they had to have a private driver take them to and from work every day, and that costs $500 a month. And that care worker who's there with them at the job to make sure that they're safe and understand the responsibilities of their tasks, if that's worth another $800, well, now the earnings are only $700 a month. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about how we report back to Social Security, how much our loved one made for the month. Those costs that are associated with being able to do the job reduce the taxable earnings that get reported. Okay. So there is a play back and forth between the earnings we make and how much we get from government benefits. But I also think it's difficult to know what the best course of action is for a family because everybody's got different resources. It might be that we want to shoot for the person to work on their own for as long as possible. And if they start that career in their early 20s, they only need 3 out of 6 years. So 12 out of 24 quarters of earnings at a substantial gainful activity level, so roughly $1,500 during that period, to start qualifying for Social Security benefits like you and I might over the course of our career. We have to do it for a 10-year period, 40 quarters. They'll look earlier in your 20s. If you do work then, it's a shorter number of quarters that are required. And then if the person does those quarters and is unable to work later on in their life post age 30, for example, they can get Social Security disability income on their work record. So they might have lost SSI because they were too successful with their job early. They can get SSDI on their own earnings record. So that's something to think about. If your loved one's got more ability to work, they want to do it, encourage it, play to their strengths, think about what their passions are. And if you can find a business that fits what they want to do and they can be successful at it, by all means, push in that direction. We hate to hear that families say, oh, I don't lose my SSI benefits, so they're just going to sit at home and do nothing. That's not a good answer for anybody, in my opinion, right? That's purely my opinion, but that's not a great approach. There's so many benefits outside the earnings. Yes, it makes the SSI check more complicated. Yes, it increases reporting responsibilities, but the benefits to the individual are significant. So think through all that and think about what the right Medicaid support services are in your state, and certainly apply for those as you're applying for initial SSI and Medicaid. In every state, that process is different. I would love it if we could nationalize that and be one set of rules, but with all of you in different states, I can't possibly tell you what the best services process is going to be. Every state delivers their Medicaid in different ways. Randi, do you have a question to share?
There's a question here. I'm just responding, but it looks as though a lot of people are following up. So it's a good one to ask. Someone wrote, I was told that if you have a paying job, you cannot get an aid or assistance at work. And I'm not sure if the individual means a job coach, but that was the question.
Yeah, from our experience, I would say that it's going to totally be dependent on the employer, not on some federal rule. So if the company won't allow it, then okay, it is what it is. But I would say that most companies that want to hire our loved ones understand that having them be as successful as possible might require a once a week aide to be present, or maybe a daily aide to be present. I think about one family we work with where the individual has epilepsy, is on the autism spectrum, and needs 24/7 oversight. And ironically, the school's transition program suggested, oh, why don't you pursue pushing shopping carts? Well, the kid's a bright kid, and the world needs people to bring the shopping carts back to the stores, but that's probably underutilizing that person's skills. He has no interest in grocery stores. He happens to have a lot of interest in astronomy and astrology and the stars and the cosmos and rocketry, and really loves space. And so I talked to the family. I said, well, think about it. He's going to need a 24/7 person with him at work or at home. And in Chicago, 6 months of the year, we get snow. It's pretty miserable being outside. And if you happen to have a seizure while he's outside, that's going to be much more challenging for that care worker to provide care and get them safely into the store than if he has a desk job where he's not going to fall and hurt himself. And that person can be right there next to him, overseeing what they're doing and being available if needed. And then playing to the strengths, right? We don't want to have people taking the most menial task because it checks a box for somebody who's trying to get them into a job. So when you're working with government agencies, my own parents went through this with my brother. They wanted him to do absolutely awful things for a career that he was way overqualified for. And eventually, through their own work and efforts, found him a job working in the county library in St. Louis, where he's now been for over 20 years, working very successfully with several promotions, and he loves what he does. And so a lot of times, unfortunately, it falls on the families to really kind of push back against agencies and school districts that say, okay, from what we know of your loved one, here's what they should do. Well, you know best, you're the family. What are the skills and interests? Where are the passions? Like any of us, if we do what we love doing, we're more excited about going to work, about making the contribution to the company. That's what we should be focused on. And then utilizing those supports to help make that happen. Now, I'd love to tell you it's easy. I'd love to tell you there's thousands of companies out there looking for that. Some of the work that we do at Oak Wealth Advisors is actually partnering with some of the groups that are looking nationally about how do we help train the companies to make environments such that our loved ones can be more successful. So kind of twisting it around. Instead of like fixing the challenges the person has, fix corporate America to be more accepting of the skills they do have and give them a better pathway forward. And so that's coming. I think there's a lot of companies that are aware of that. I mean, very specifically, a lot of the data-focused jobs that are somewhat repetitive and challenging and detail-oriented are wonderful for our loved ones on the autism spectrum who don't mind repetitive tasks that are detail-oriented. They can be very successful in those roles and have big jobs. In fact, Randi and I were on a call yesterday with a family where the individual's got some pretty profound challenges, but mentally is pretty sharp. You're gonna make 6 figures working for Amazon. Awesome. Guess what? You're losing benefits. Who cares? You're making 6 figures. That's a fantastic career path for you. Good for you for finding a wonderful job that suits your abilities and skills, and you can do that. Now that's a unicorn, right? Most of our families don't have a loved one who's going to achieve a 6-figure income. It's not realistic planning. If it happens, great. We'll work with that. But for most of our loved ones, it's a question of weighing benefits you're getting versus the opportunity through vocation. And again, as I said at the start, and I'll finish with that, it's not all about the paycheck. Okay. So
Can I add one thing? Is that okay,
Sure.
Mike?
Please, Randi.
Also, thanks. Also, finding a benevolent employer, finding somebody or a company or an agency or an organization, somebody in your catchment area, somebody within your community, somebody that knows your family, somebody that understands your loved one's challenges, strengths, what they need to be working on, their skill sets, their level of interest, that sort of thing, what their passions are. I know that, it's easy just to kind of say all that, but creating your web, your network of individuals, your families, the community, I would really start to focus on that sooner rather than later, because you never know who's going to know somebody that knows somebody. That's what I have found. It's not easy. It's a lot of work, but we're sort of all used to that anyway. So what's another little bit of work, but finding somebody, an employer that gets it is huge. That's my 2 cents.
And actually a transition off of that to then move on to housing. I think one of our biggest frustrations as a firm is how much work the families have to do. My daughter was responsible for creating a database of companies that employ or were built around individuals with disabilities. There's 3,000 of them she could find online. So there's a lot of companies out there that are doing this well, or they've been created to help people. The number of those companies that had to be created by the family and put the business around the person is staggering. I wish it wasn't the case, and hopefully in a decade it'll be less of that. But that also plays into housing, where so many times we see that the families are struggling to find those resources. The cool thing is I'll spend less time on this topic today with your group, because with Together for Choice and the resources you'll have with respect to housing and knowledge about different opportunities in multiple states, you guys have a wonderful relationship there to do that. We would tell you that the questions we typically see are, how do we find that resource? So Together for Choice becomes an option for us to refer families to. Looking in the home community, if they want to stay where they are, it's more challenging. There are some wonderful developments that are going up. Oftentimes it requires multiple families to come together that have resources to then collaborate with the community to develop a space, which either is going to be solely for individuals with disabilities or a mixed population, which typically is more successful. And ironically, when the local communities hear about it, they're like, oh, nobody wants to move there. That's not the reality. And those that we've seen, typically the homes for those without disabilities sell out in the community even before those get filled with those families who've got a loved one with a special need. So those are happening more and more. To me and to Randi, it's still sad that so many families have to do so much of the heavy lifting. We wish there's more great agencies that are like the ones connected to Together for Choice, where there are good solutions and there are great models that other people can follow to replicate those success stories in their communities. But again, it comes down to, again, the individual person. There's no right housing solution. And in Illinois, there's been a huge push to get rid of what they call institutional housing. Well, Misericordia, for those of you who live in Illinois, is a fantastic place to live. We've got families we work with who are desperate to get into Misericordia because it's such a fantastic place. But because they're responsible, for so many individuals, and some other places are high-rise apartments. Well, high-rise apartment tends to be, from a government standpoint, an institution because you have lots of people housed in a relatively small footprint. That would be the best solution for their care, for their networking with their peers. That might be what they would want to choose. And so for us, we want to, kind of follow along with the title of Together for Choice. We want those options to be out there. We don't want some place where somebody's just literally put in a room, left there all day, and nobody takes care of them. That's disgusting and awful. That should clearly be stopped. But a place where it's loving, supportive, engaged, people are involved in the community. That's what you want. And how that's formed, we don't care. Right? Look for the options that you think are best for your individual. Is it having them live with a friend and having a support worker come in and help them? Use of technology has also become a bigger thing where with two-way communication, you can put cameras in an apartment, you can live in your house, and you can talk to your loved one throughout the day using those cameras. You can see if they haven't gotten out of bed by noon. That's a problem. Let's wake them up. Did they eat breakfast? Well, I didn't see you in the kitchen. Where'd you eat? So technology allows for people to live more independently, while caregivers, typically a family member, can keep track of what's going on and help them. And I would tell you that you guys probably have better math than we do, but north of 80% of all loved ones with disabilities end up living at home with their parents. My own brother's the same way. My parents finally allowed me to push them into a senior living community. They're in their mid-80s. My brother's 53 now. The cool thing for my brother is that that senior community allowed him to move with my parents. So when they pass away, he can stay there. That's becoming more of an opportunity for our loved ones. So if that idea of mom and dad would provide the care for as long as possible in the household setting, if your loved one can move with you to a senior living facility, great, you can keep that going. I don't know if it's the best answer for everybody. Again, this is a very individualized type of planning, but knowing that that opportunity does exist in more and more places, that a senior community where you go when you get older may also accept your adult with different challenges. And as Ashley and Randy and I were talking before we started the presentation today, it's really difficult sometimes to find the right housing solution when different organizations won't accept your loved one if they have fill in the blank, behavioral issues, a mental health diagnosis, which I find horrifying because we should be providing resources and opportunities for all of our loved ones, regardless of a diagnosis. But just understand that you might hear of a great opportunity that a friend did, and it may not be an opportunity for you. So again, creating that network, those resources, having feelers out to people who are successfully happy with how their loved one transitioned to independent living is great. And again, utilizing networks and resources like Together for Choice to see what's coming online. They're going to be a great resource for telling you what's new and what the opportunities are. So with that leads to the last topic. So I have a few minutes left for questions at the end. A care guide and letter of intent. All the planning we're doing is great. Lots of information over these sessions, but so much of it ends up in mom and dad's head. And when you pass away, the challenge becomes, how does the next caregiver, whether it's a sibling, a relative, or an independent agency or professional, how are they going to know what that loved one needs if they don't have great communication skills? So with a letter of intent or a care guide, it gives you the ability to document that. What are the strengths and weaknesses? What are the unique quirks that are acceptable? What are behaviors that are not acceptable and need to be addressed? Who are the medical professionals that you don't want to ever have your loved one see again because they did a poor job or there's a bad relationship or whatever reason? Which are the ones that are more successful? Because it might be possible for a future caregiver to see all the medical professionals in the history, but not really know quality-wise which ones were the best. If a medication has been tried and was awful, had bad side effects, document that. We want to make sure that that document gets shared. And so on the next page, I'll show you the kinds of things you want to have in the document. Our preference is that you do this electronically. You can either have it all in one document, or there's new apps coming out all the time. The one we have here in our example is VestLife, which is vestlife.com. You can log on and look at theirs, where you compartmentalize different levels of care and different types of care. And you can then share those with the specific people who will be involved in your loved one's life. So maybe someone doesn't need to see the finances outside the trust, but needs to understand all about the medical side of their background. Or maybe it's the daily activities of living. How do they progress with those? What are their strengths and weaknesses? Well, the trustee doesn't need to see that necessarily, but the caregiver does. So you can compartmentalize what gets shared with whom. There's all kinds of data protection on that. And so that's another way to do it if you don't have it all in a single document. But regardless, you want to make sure that the people you want to have play a future role know the document exists, know what role you have in mind for them, so they can tell you, you know what, I'm going to be living in another state. It's not going to be me. I wish I could help, but I can't. Or I'm going to be too busy. You know, I love so-and-so, but I just can't provide the level of care they're going to need. Much better to get those answers now, when you can find other people to play those roles then have it happen after you're dead, and you can't change that, and nobody else is going to be able to step up. So with the care guide, we would tell you these are the key elements to include. You can put as much emphasis on one of these topics or another, but you want to cover medical information, relationships like friendships and people who are in the person's life, whether it's at work or elsewhere, their abilities and challenges, routines, religious traditions, family traditions, their likes and dislikes, so they can't communicate that. And then favorite stories. If there are things that make them smile when they hear that story again, write that down. It's kind of a cool way to keep family traditions alive. And then their wishes and dreams. If they can't communicate that, document it for them so they know that they're aspiring to do this or that. That's cool for a future caregiver to help them along their journey when you're no longer able to. So again, the care guide's gonna be very flexible. Real short on time, I'll let Randi tell you that the 3 things you need to have a successful care guide when you're documenting it are—
The 3 things you need:
Do it, Randi.
tissues, chocolate, and if you like to drink, a little bit of wine helps and goes a long way.
There you go. So tissues, chocolate, and wine will make you more successful in drafting your letter of intent for your care guide. We hope that that goes well for everybody. It'll be the most important document you leave behind, and attorneys will tell you that too. Even though they might get paid $5 grand to draft your trust, they will tell you that the care guide is a more important document because it's going to be more comprehensive and it's more focused on your loved one's care. So with that, we will pimp for our YouTube channel. If you want to go look at whiteboard videos like they used to do for those UPS commercials where they hand kind of scribble stuff and the information becomes available as they draw, you can go there. There's about 12 or 15 different educational 1-minute videos on different topics, many of which we've covered with Together for Choice. Way to review that with a much more entertaining speaker than me. That's our Oak Wealth Advisors YouTube channel with educational materials, and everything I said today might have been made up, even though I was trying to do my best. None of it may be specifically pertinent to your specific challenges, but hopefully you now understand more about your options and your opportunities. And with that, we'll take any follow-up questions, and I can stay a little longer past the hour, but I appreciate everybody's time in attending today. If you have questions after today, feel free to reach out to Randi or myself. That's my email address there, Mike at Oak Wealth. Randi is Randi at Oak Wealth. You can reach out to either one of us or call that phone number and get both of us on the phone to help tackle a specific question you may have.